Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our program. Please welcome Paul Ray to the stage.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for being with us tonight. I'm here to say a few words about the Lee Edwards Lecture in Conservative Leadership. It's right and just to name this lecture series after Dr. Edwards. After all, no one did more than he to understand and help others to understand the qualities of mind and heart that made the men and women of the conservative revolution who they were, the kind of men and women who shaped their times and the times that have followed. Our gathering today has special poignancy as the first Edwards Lecture after Dr. Edwards' passing in December of last year. Many of those in this room first knew Dr. Edwards as a colleague. Not a few probably met him first in one of his many books. I met him first at an old manor in the Blue Ridge Mountains. We both happened to be making a silent retreat. The custom of the house is to celebrate the retreat's end with conversation and a glass or two of whiskey. As I talked with Dr. Edwards, I had the overwhelming impression of a man entirely forgetful of himself and attentive to the person in front of him, a man whose immense intellectual accomplishments were joined to a profound simplicity of soul, and for whom the good life was not just an object of political action, but a lived reality. So it's in every way fitting to offer this lecture series in his honor. It's also fitting that our speaker tonight will be introduced by Eric Patterson, the president and CEO of the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation. The foundation and the museum, which is its creation, is one of Dr. Edwards' greatest legacies to the conservative movement. Dr. Patterson became head of VOC last year. Before that, he served as president of the Religious Freedom Institute and as dean in the Robertson School of Government at Regent University, where he continues to hold a position as scholar at large. He's worked as a White House fellow and in the State Department and as an Air National Guard commander. He is the author of over 20 books, including Just American Wars, Ethical Dilemmas in U.S. Military History, and the co-edited volume, The Reagan Manifesto, A Time for Choosing and Its Influence. And as you'll soon find, he is a thoughtful and eloquent spokesman for the causes we in this room believe in. I'm honored to welcome Dr. Patterson to the podium to introduce tonight's speaker.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here with you. And I want to, in particular, say thank you. I look around this room and I see all of these smiling faces. And when I say the word Lee Edwards, you can't see it, but you're smiling at me. Isn't that the way that the legacy of Lee was? He was a happy warrior, a man of great intellect, of great courage, but he was someone who, when you talk about him, brings a smile to people's faces because of his warm, generous, convivial nature. And so it's right and fitting for us to honor him tonight. As Paul said, one of the great legacies of Lee Edwards' life, and there were many, such as helping co-found YAF and other things, was the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation. And he wrote the mission statement to educate all generations about the terrible history, ideology, and legacy of communism. And that's what we do at the Victims of Communism Foundation. And I'd be remiss if I didn't tell you that Lee would want for you to come and visit the museum if you haven't visited it to this point. And since it's so new, I know a few of you haven't been there yet, so please come and visit us. Well, this wouldn't be possible tonight without our friends at National Review Institute and, of course, the Heritage Foundation for co-sponsoring and hosting. So to all of you, thank you very much. Lee had another great legacy. He was proud of his wife, Anne, and he was delighted in his daughters, Catherine, who works for us part-time writing curriculum for us, and of course, our speaker tonight, Dr. Elizabeth Edwards Spalding. Dr. Spalding is an outstanding scholar and author about the American presidency, about U.S. foreign policy trends, about national security, and about U.S. history. And with a particular focus in recent years on this clash of ideologies between the values that we hold dear in the West and the godless, atheistic, materialist values of communism. She holds a number of appointments. Many of you know that in the past, she's taught at George Mason University, the Catholic University of America, at Claremont McKenna College. She's currently a senior fellow at Pepperdine University School of Public Policy. She also serves as a visiting fellow at Hillsdale College's Van Andel Graduate School of Government. And of course, we're proud that she serves as chairman of the board of trustees of VOC and as the founding director of our museum, which opened in 2022. Now, over the years, she's been the recipient of many awards. As a younger scholar, she received the Lassen, DuPont, Madison, Weaver, and Judd Fellowships. She holds degrees from Hillsdale College and from the University of Virginia. Last year, she was honored by her alma mater, Hillsdale College, with the Elizabeth Smith Friedman Award for Freedom. Congratulations. She's a well-regarded author with scholarly works in many peer-reviewed journals, such as Journal of Church and State and others, as well as many popular works, including in National Review. Regarding her first book, The First Cold Warrior, Harry Truman, Containment, and the Remaking of the Liberal International Order, the Claremont Review of Books said, quote, "We owe Spalding a debt of gratitude for shedding important new light on the Truman administration and on the character of its central figure." Another reviewer suggested that she may have opened up an entirely new way of thinking about U.S. foreign policy. Of course, she co-authored a book, which many of you have read, with her father. That book, A Brief History of the Cold War, has been called the following by Stephen Knott at the U.S. Naval War College. Quote, "It is a remarkable accomplishment. It is concise and beautifully written, truly masterful and accessible, a gem of a book." Now, I'm confident that tonight's lecture will be a gem of a lecture. So would you help me in welcoming Dr. Elizabeth Edwards Spalding?
Thank you. It's good to be here. It is an honor to give the Heritage Foundation's annual Lee Edwards Lecture in Conservative Leadership. A word is in order about the namesake of this lecture and this evening's co-sponsors. Growing up in the home of Lee and Ann Edwards, my sister and I were taught and observed many good things. We have folded these truths, along with our father's and his father's love of alliteration, into our own lives, grounded in faith, family, and freedom. And I'm grateful this evening, as you've already heard, to be joined not only by my sister, but also by my husband, Matthew, and our children, Joseph and Catherine. This event, as you've already started to hear, forms a perfect intersection of three organizations that were so very important to my dad: the Heritage Foundation, National Review Institute and National Review, and last but not least, the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation, or what we call VOC. Each has a distinctive mission. What connects these three organizations is their principled aim to be on the right side in the war of ideas. Who is a leader that unites them? Well, I've been thinking about Ronald Reagan, and not just because of this lecture. For the contemporary era, he is my #1 president for our topic this evening, leadership. What he faced, what he learned, experienced, and brought to what he faced, and what he did as president was right and generally successful in the context of the Cold War. And his overall approach seems relevant for today in what is variously called new Cold Wars, Cold War 2.0, or a second Cold War. I also think it's suitable to focus on Reagan, and especially how he became Reagan, since he brings together two men that we are remembering this evening as well, and have talked a little bit about: Lee Edwards and William F. Buckley, Jr. So, Lee Edwards, Dad. He wrote the first political biography of Reagan, which was published in 1967 and based on interviews and research that preceded Reagan's first term as governor of California. The book reflected Dad's insight that Reagan was the future of both the conservative movement and the American presidency. He revised the biography twice more, most recently in 1981. When he presented that updated edition to Ronald Reagan in the Oval Office, the president looked down at the glossy cover featuring a full-color smiling headshot of himself against the red and white stripes of the American flag, and a bright yellow banner across the bottom right diagonal that proclaimed in all capital letters, "Complete through the assassination attempt." And Reagan looked at my dad and said, as only Reagan could, "Well, Lee, I'm sorry I ruined your ending." Over 20 years later, Dad returned to Reagan in another book, which permitted coverage of the presidential and post-presidential years. The other man is Bill Buckley. This year, 2025, marks WFB 100, in which National Review Institute, and the conservative movement as a whole remember the life and legacy of Buckley, leading up to the centennial of his birth this November. In 1964, Dad was an early adopter of Reagan as future American president, not just the national conservative leader after Barry Goldwater. By his own admission, Buckley took years longer. As late as January 1968, so this is years after meeting Reagan in 1961, in a jaw-dropping story that sounds like it was ripped from a movie script, and starting decades-long correspondences with both Ronald and Nancy Reagan in 1965, Bill Buckley maintained that there was no way a former actor could go for president. Nonetheless, they formed a special friendship. Buckley later wrote that he knew Reagan as a friend and, in a sense, as a tutor. But all this said, there was a long period, years and years, where conservatives were told to get over Reagan, to move past what was characterized as hagiography of him and his outmoded leadership. I'm here to say that we need lessons from Reagan's leadership more than ever. There are still big oceans out there, and we still require the best captains and sailors. The statesman must navigate the ship of state on the turbulent political seas, just as he did during the Cold War, which was an unprecedented, protracted international conflict. Plus, the existential East-West clash between the forces of freedom and truth on the one side and those of expansionist communist ideology on the other still demanded a grasp of geopolitics and history. The outcome then was not guaranteed, nor is it today. The ship of state is a time-tested way of helping us know what to look for and expect of our statesmen in politics. This is true of all politics, including world politics, where statesmen typically have less control due to external factors, but often more power than in domestic politics. The president is the key figure for us as Americans. This begs the primary question: what characterizes conservative leadership in the Oval Office? My students would say that I would say that any president should start with the Constitution and his unique, powerful oath for a unique, powerful office. Character matters too, that of the individual carrying out the powers and duties of the unitary chief executive in a constitutional republic. It also means understanding the character of that republic, including its limited nature, its institutions, its dispersed powers, and its checks and balances, and that of the American people who make that republic possible. Additional qualities matter, but if the president is possessed of these two, constitutionalism and good character, then he starts with a solid base as a leader. Then there is that word leader, which may sound a bit too modern and potentially capital P progressive for some Americans, including conservatives. We will table that for now in a lecture named for my father and for conservative leadership, and say that conservative leadership and authentic statesmanship can be very much alike. We are amidst the 40th anniversaries of all things Reagan. This year alone brings the 40th anniversary of everything from Reagan's second inaugural, to the public articulation of the Reagan Doctrine, to the president's first communications with the then new Soviet General Secretary Mikhail Gorbachev, and their consequential first summit meeting in Geneva. To ask how Reagan was a successful statesman in the Cold War is to consider what made Reagan Reagan. He brought everything he was into the White House. In retrospect, it appears as if he were in training for the 1980s and its circumstances for his whole life. Reagan stressed that he had lived through 2 world wars and the Great Depression, in addition to decades of the Cold War before the presidency. He identified the Depression as the single most important influence in his life. It is crucial for what followed that Reagan was a young and middle-aged adult during the Franklin, Roosevelt, Truman, and Eisenhower administrations. He saw these great presidents' ups, downs, and in-betweens. He witnessed and then had time to judge over the years what they said and did well and not so well. FDR first and Dwight Eisenhower second are usually noted as key modern presidential influences on Reagan. But pause a moment on Harry Truman. In the 1940s and into the 1950s, that is, coinciding with Truman's presidency, Reagan was a small L liberal, capital D Democrat. He was never a progressive, capital L liberal like FDR and his closest supporters. The latter was the type that Buckley criticized in Up From Liberalism, and with his confreres would later go on to criticize in NR and on Firing Line and elsewhere. Reagan was the type of small L liberal who believed, as he put it in a 1947 interview, "Our highest aim should be the cultivation of freedom of the individual, for therein lies the highest dignity of man. Tyranny is tyranny, and whether it comes from the right, left, or center, it is evil." At this time, there was agreement in US public opinion about the threat from Soviet communism, but not about how to respond. There were policy disagreements across the political spectrum. Reagan watched as progressives who became friendly with communists and advocated peace split with the liberals in the Democratic Party who advocated freedom and peace. He also saw resistance in the Republican Party to US engagement in foreign policy on generally American internationalist terms. Senator Robert Taft eventually backed the Truman Doctrine, reluctantly supported the Marshall Plan, and strongly opposed the North Atlantic Treaty. Meanwhile, Senator Arthur Vandenberg worked as a bridge builder between his fellow Republicans and Democrats, including closely with Truman himself. Such statesmen of both political parties were the original Cold Warriors, and Reagan was on their page. He also learned about the importance of political relationships and alliances. In terms of his professional life, this post-war period was also crucial for what followed for Reagan. He served as president of the Screen Actors Guild from 1947 to 1952, and again from 1959 to 1960, and as General Electric Theater host on television and GE's traveling ambassador, those are his words to describe it, from 1954 to 1962. Reagan married his second wife, Nancy, in 1952, and started a family with her. And he was constantly reading and writing at home and on trains in his ongoing self-education, covering most topics of the day, including communism. This time was active, interactive, immersive, intellectual. On the base of the Great Depression and World War II, this decade and a half set Reagan up well, not only for the speech, which he honed in the GE years leading up to Senator Barry Goldwater's 1964 run for the presidency, but also for his California governor years from 1967 to 1975, followed by his productive wilderness years, so to speak, on radio and the mashed potato speaking circuit before the presidency from 1975 to 1979. Through his work and travels, he gained direct experience, too, in the importance of political relationships, of friends, allies, negotiations, and more, both at home and abroad. This extended period also shaped Reagan in 4 general areas: political, strategic, moral, and religious, that he brought to and used in the White House. They remain helpful in thinking about today's world. Political. Reagan placed the Cold War and the necessities, requirements, and contingencies imposed by the central conflict of his time in his overall framework for politics. Justice was central, as was freedom, a good in and of itself and a necessity to the exercise of justice. He wanted to be a man of peace, not war, and said this privately and publicly. For Reagan, peace followed from justice and freedom and should be defined by those with a similar outlook. This is a key reason that a recurring Reagan theme concerns the importance of and need for the unity of the West against communist totalitarianism. The principles inspiring a government mattered to him, as did its structuring institutions and attitude toward the individual, family, and community. Reagan viewed radical ideology, a single fixed worldview that carried within it a revolutionary plan to transform man, state, and society, as a perversion of politics. In the 20th century, such ideology generated totalitarianism in 2 primary species: communism and Nazism. From the 1940s on, Reagan spoke against totalitarianism and often interchanged use of totalitarian and communist when referring to the Soviet Union. In general, Reagan viewed totalitarianism as an instrument seeking a bad end, with its rotten core made up of radical ideology and an illegitimate regime. For Reagan, as for other students of totalitarianism, the ideology and the lies upon which it is based informs the ism. Strategic. Reagan viewed the Cold War as a real conflict. He did not promote mere stability between what he viewed as 2 worlds at complete odds. He did not want a hot war, but knew there was always a risk. And he analyzed especially the Vietnam War and its wake, including Cambodia, in the 1970s. He thought détente was not only politically and morally mistaken, but also strategically incorrect, because it enabled Soviet internal repression and outward aggression, and extended the Cold War. In this sense, the US defense buildup and the economic and technological strangulation of the USSR in the 1980s were President Reagan's tools, not ends. So were diplomacy and dialogue. In changing circumstances, Reagan could and would use various tools. At the highest level, he set forth a forward strategy for freedom to achieve peace through strength. Reagan knew the enemy and quoted Lenin to help illuminate the stakes of the Cold War. One example from Lenin: "It is inconceivable that the Soviet Republic should continue to exist for a long period side by side with imperialistic states. Ultimately, one or the other must conquer. And in my research at the Reagan Library, I have found Reagan using a variation on this quote from Lenin as early as 1961. Reagan later cited Brezhnev about the correlation of forces being on communism's side, and he understood that communists did not define coexistence as Western détentistes did. For Reagan, the Cold War could not be wished away. That was idealism. Or made into routine balance of power politics. That was realism. Again, as early as 1961, Reagan stated, "There can only be one end to the war we are in. It won't go away if we simply try to outwait it. Wars end in victory or defeat." This is the strategic context in which to place Reagan's famous "we win, they lose" through peace through strength. Moral. As he had taken Lenin seriously as a strategic thinker, Reagan took the American and Soviet regimes seriously. The United States form of government was built on natural and God-given rights, the consent of the governed, the rule of law, and limited government. Our rights were secured, not created, by this Republican form of government. And you can see Reagan saying variations of this for decades. In opposition, the Soviet Union system required the abolition of individual rights, the false promise and subsequent negation of collective rights, lack of consent and the repression of dissent, tyranny, and the unlimited one-party state. When Reagan referred in a 1975 radio commentary to a disease like communism, he offered a regime judgment. Due to this understanding of the regime, Reagan distinguished between legitimate and illegitimate governments. The Soviet Union, although a superpower in world affairs by dint of its military and natural resources, was, in Reagan's view, an illegitimate regime. If it could go, it should go. This is the moral context in which to put Reagan's "we win, they lose" through peace through strength. For Reagan, the USSR was not only illegitimate with respect to its government and its treatment of the peoples within its legally recognized borders, but it was also an illegitimate empire with respect to the peoples and nations it enslaved and threatened outside its legally recognized borders. No moral equivalence could be made between the opposing regimes in the Cold War. Religious. Reagan's oldest, deepest well of inspiration, his religious faith, infuses the political, strategic, and moral. It is everywhere, especially informing Reagan's moral clarity and the core of his Cold War political rhetoric, speaking the truth and identifying the Soviet Union as an evil empire. How did Reagan look at God and the human condition, at grace and our flaws, at problems ultimately conquered by faith, hope, and love? Of the theological virtues, Reagan was a man of hope with faith and love. He believed in the triumph of good, not passively, not fatalistically, with man and in practice, Americans and others of goodwill doing their part in God's divine plan. Part of the reason that the Cold War was winnable for Reagan was that the genus of totalitarianism, including its Soviet communist species, was evil. This meant it should not, and ultimately could not, stand forever. Atheistic communism aimed to overturn and remake what God had made, including the highest part of his creation, human beings. For Reagan, it mattered that man was made in the image and likeness of God. As a result, human beings were not to be reduced to mere matter, as in Marxism. God was omnipotent, so power could be used for good purposes, although Reagan deeply agreed with Lord Acton that absolute power in the hands of human beings corrupts absolutely. For Reagan, there was prudence propelling the exercise of power in peace through strength, because he believed that freedom flowed from what is morally right, while communism was evil, false, and wrong. Thus, as president in the circumstances of the 1980s, He viewed the Soviet Union as the focus of evil in the modern world. We live in dangerous times, but the real question is, when have we not? Peace through strength is often invoked these days. That is generally to the good, since Reagan is most associated with this phrase, and there are many lessons to be learned from his statesmanship. Two more lessons that I have only alluded to here are Reagan's understanding of the strengths inherent in free enterprise and in allies, whether individuals, countries, or collective defense arrangements. Reagan took as a given the time-tested truth going back to the ancient world and expressed by George Washington at the beginning of the American Republic, peace through strength. For America, this has meant all types of strength: political, economic, military, cultural, moral, spiritual. While they were never unimportant, strengths in information, innovation, and technology have become increasingly significant in the modern age of radical ideological foes. The seemingly protracted conflict against the axis of aggression, the People's Republic of China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea, is not the same as the Cold War. But in Mark Twain's truism, it rhymes. Today's opposition is characterized by primary and junior partners of conviction and convenience, as in the Cold War. This time, the Chinese Communist Party, the CCP, plays more like the USSR, and Russia more like the PRC. Moral clarity and other lessons from Reagan's statesmanship, not the statecraft practices of the Nixon through Carter years, should help guide our ship of state. There can be no reverse Kissinger, as Hal Brands puts it, toward the CCP and Russia. In Cold War 2.0, North Korea is still North Korea, but with nuclear weapons. Iran is an ideological authoritarian regime working, for now, with its Axis partners. What we face looks like a combination of the threats of the 1930s and 1940s and the 1970s. The central question of the Cold War was if freedom or communism would predominate, win, and shape the world in which we lived. Granting differences, this is still the central question of our time. Today's Western leaders, including the American president, should pursue peace through strength with a forward strategy of freedom. At the heart of that approach is making clear that the PRC is an evil empire, the focus of evil in our modern world, with, for the foreseeable future, its own axis of aggression. All who are on the side of truth and freedom face a time for choosing. Thank you.
Good evening. I want to thank all of you for coming. I am Jim Garrity. I am the senior political correspondent of National Review, because that's what you call a political correspondent who gets old. Elizabeth, I only got a chance to speak to your father a few times at National Review events, but he was just the kindest man. And if any of you did not have a chance to meet him, he was just the kind of guy who knew everything, but did not feel the need to tell you that he knew everything. And in Washington, that's kind of a rare personality. So. We have 17 minutes, so I'm going to dive right into this. I want to talk about communism, and one of the first questions on my mind as we look at this perspective of today, think back to the Reagan years, the Buckley years, do Americans remember and think about communism accurately? And for all the lawyers in the audience, I'm probably going to lead the witness. I suspect the answer is no. So if the answer is no, why not?
Well, I think part of it is that people just don't know history in general. And then they think that it's historical. And then, so why do you need to know about something that's history and historical? I also think that unlike education about the Holocaust and things having to do with Nazism, communism hasn't been as taught as well in the United States and in other countries, but especially our own, as that topic. And so at VOC, one of our efforts is to make sure that people know that kind of history as well as they do the Holocaust history. So I think some of it is just plain old ignorance and how higher ed and K-12 ed are set up. Some of it, though, is deliberate and pernicious, too. And then we've got to remember that communism presents itself as something that's attractive. And so some people get sucked in that way.
That leads very naturally into my next question. Every time I see some snot-nosed punk on a college campus wearing a Che t-shirt, first, I hope he paid retail. Second of all, there are times I actually kind of wonder if seeing Che as a new t-shirt logo, kind of like the Nike swoosh, is some of like someone wonder if that's the ultimate triumph of capitalism, that even Che has turned into a consumer product. But I noticed there are t-shirts of Che, but not Pol Pot or Khrushchev. Just do it, comrade. Is there, like, they're curious, like, is it they picked the youngest, hunkiest communist leader to make it cool? Or what is your thoughts on, ironically, the branding of communism?
Right. I think that they've done a good job. The Che shirts are very good. The hammer and sickle have been made into something that's got, a kitschy attraction. The leftover Soviet military gear, you can buy that too. What I'm waiting for that I haven't seen yet is the hot Stalin either T-shirt, poster, or mug.
He looked like a hipster in his 20s, yes. This guy would be telling you,
yes.
Oh, I was into that band before it was cool.
Yes. Yeah. So during the period where he was already a committed Marxist-Leninist, but he was also a thug, a criminal, an assassin, all these things. He was pretty good looking, and you can find a couple of photos. And so I am now using in talks that I give to high schoolers and college students a picture of hot Stalin. Like I juxtapose him with Stalin that you know from your textbooks, and then I talk about what he was really like, and that makes some inroads. Okay. So
I just want to point out right now, the World Socialist website is writing a news alert. Heritage expert admits Stalin was hot. I just want you to know. So I kind of suspect that to the average American, on those occasions when communism comes up at the dinner table or something, non-academic, non-historian circles, communism, socialism, Marxism, they're kind of used as synonyms. They're used pretty interchangeably. Does that matter? For example, like Bernie Sanders is a socialist, or would describe himself as a socialist. He would not say that he's a communist. Yes. I don't know if he's a Marxist, Groucho, or Harpo. But so do those distinctions matter for the broader American public discourse, or does everybody kind of generally get it? Does the right sometimes throw around these terms in ways that, should they be interchangeable? I guess is a way of putting it.
Right. That's a great question. It does and it doesn't matter. I mean, if you're gonna be able to explain this to other people at some point, you need to know the differences between the terms. But if we're just having basically most Americans understand that all of them are bad, then I'm fine with interchanging use of the terms. And I think also having people understand something about Marxism in the day that we're in now, with so much of our problems kind of coming from the fruit of the bad tree of Karl Marx in cultural Marxism, all the different branches and twigs and everything else, that it's very helpful to know something about Marxism that way. But I'm also fine with it all getting mixed together if people know something.
So I've been thinking about one of the things that makes life harder for us anti-communists is that there are several important countries in this world, China most prominently, but I think we could throw Vietnam in this category, who still describe themselves as communist. But compared to, compared to a generation ago or 2 generations ago, they have much more free market economics. They have, my understanding is that, people feared after the Vietnam War, you would see posters of a beady-eyed red and white logo of a colonel looking down on you. And it turned out to be Colonel Sanders. There's KFCs all over Vietnam now. Does it muddy the waters of what we think about communism in that there are some self-professed communist countries that now some parts of them look pretty American, and Anthony Bourdain goes to Vietnam and sits there with Obama and acts like they're just another Asian country?
It does muddy the waters, and I think we need to pull back and look again at what it all means, because if you accept Marx's own terms, then the economic is what's most important, right? And so it's ironic that there are some, I don't know if I want to call it market elements, because the state's still permitting it and controlling it. So it's not really market elements, but there's some things that look a little bit like capitalism.
Consumer culture has, yeah.
Right, definitely. So that can muddy the waters. But if you look at all of the criteria, what it's for the one-party state, what it's for the Communist Party, what it's for, then it's not free, and they don't have any other rights. I mean, Vietnam, which a lot of people say, isn't Vietnam pretty free now? There's no free speech. There's no, worship. It is still so repressive. They arrest people. The difference now is maybe people are not tortured as much, but they're still arrested and thrown into jails.
You talked quite a bit about Reagan in your remarks, and I particularly enjoyed your line about zombie Reaganism. Because if you are, first of all, I point out, Reagan was president from when I was like 5 to 13. So once your formulative years are with President Reagan, you kind of figure all U.S. presidents are going to be that good. And I don't want to speak for anybody else, but I feel like everything's been a disappointment since then. Some worse than others. And but I kind of have this, when people say, oh, you conservatives, you folks at National Review, probably you guys, the Heritage Foundation get it too, all you want is zombie Reagan. And I sit there and my first response to that is that an option? Can we do that? Because there's nothing I'd love more than to see the Oval Office and to see that familiar face and say, well, my fellow Americans, Nancy and I have been deciding what the country needs most, and it's brains. So you touched on this a bit. Is there a possibility of updating Reaganism? Does it need to be updated? What would Reaganism in the year 2025 look like? Or is it kind of like yearning for Eisenhowerism in the 1980s or something? Is it from a past generation and could never quite be recreated in this modern media environment, political environment, geopolitical environment?
So Reagan himself would say not to recreate it, and he would be amused, like, may I watch the movie about, zombie Reagan? But he would say, I'm just doing the best of what we always did. So I think that's what we need to recover and move forward with. And we were coming up on the 250th anniversary of our birth as a country. And so this actually is a great opportunity to educate about what we're for, what freedom really means, and also what we're against, like communism, because that's been the worst assault on freedom in this modern world. So I think that would be how Reagan would be talking. One of the things that I think some people may know, but it's really underappreciated about him, is truly how widely read he was, and then he absorbed what he had read, and was educating all the time in what he was saying, both formally in speeches, but also informally in conversations. And he was doing it for the American public, but really for the whole world, and other world leaders that he interacted with included. And so that's something too. I'd like to see a president like that knows what America is and what it's based on. And, Reagan actually read the Federalist. We know he read the Federalist Papers. He read Founding Fathers. We know he read a lot in economics, good texts in economics, but we also know that he read Lenin. So he read the good stuff, but he also went and read what the enemy says so that he would understood this. And he even read Sun Tzu. That's on the trains and all that kind of stuff. So he read so many different things and then just didn't let it go away. He included that in what he did, but he was a man of action. He wasn't just an intellectual. So I would like to see, I think he would recommend knowing what we believe and why, and then using that in the circumstances that we face to move forward in both domestic and foreign policy.
I was going to say, you go back and either watch the old Reagan speeches or read them. Everyone remembers the folksy anecdotes, and they're there,
right,
but they're also information and history and argument nutrient dense. These are speeches that are good for you. You actually come away learning and knowing more than when you started. I do see heritage people with microphones, so we're going to have about 10 minutes of Q&A. I have been reminded to ask you to quote the least pithy talk show host of all time. Keep it pithy. Please do not tell us your life story as a preamble. And we will get as many questions here as we can, all depending on your pithiness. I see this guy over here.
It's Mr. Pithy.
Mr. Pithy.
I was just wondering what your thoughts were on Argentina and Malay. It's one of the countries that has really transformed between socialism and communism to a more free market in a radically short period of time compared to a lot of other countries.
Right. I think we want to keep an eye on that. I think it can be encouraging in a lot of ways. And I know that there are people even in this room who know him. So I think it's off to a good start.
Could you please give us, brilliant, thank you very much. Could you please give us your assessment of Reagan's speech on transcending communism?
Which one? Yes, yes. So I think part of this is that he understood very early on, and it's not just, he brought it to the White House with him about this theme of transcending communism. So that's present when he's working out what he believes in and why, and how he's moving from, becoming a conservative, but he didn't leave behind his, small L liberal. He just fused it with, it's the same thing, right? So he was working through what all of this meant, and he saw that even then it meant transcending communism. So there are plenty of examples of that along the way. But for people here who have not read or watched his speeches, and the great thing is that they're available online so you can actually watch them, I would say for that particular question to start with the Notre Dame address from 1981, the Parliament address from 1982, the Evil Empire address of 1983, and then, sample some things, but jump to, again, because you may not have all the time in the world, the Tear Down This Wall speech in 1987, and then go to the Moscow State University address toward the end of his presidency. And while you're there, look at him walking around before the KGB and others intervene, and see the people in Moscow in the streets trying to talk to him and touch him. And it wasn't just the students that he was reaching when he spoke at the university. So I would say that would be the beginning of it. And just an aside, since we have a lot of people here who may have even known Reagan, or some people here, it's very interesting when you go and you watch all those speeches. The 1983 Evil Empire speech is not in its entirety on anywhere, from the Reagan Library or anywhere on YouTube, because they have to switch reels. And you can actually, if you really listen, you can hear the camera guys, and I'm not sure that it's polite language. So
I'm just going to observe that.
So you can read the whole thing, but you can't watch the whole thing.
We have this memory of Reagan being this sunny optimist. And in many cases he was, but particularly when it came to the topic of communism, he was blistering. And you think about just like calling it the Evil Empire, and the entire, for those of you who watched the Masterpiece with Dennis Quaid, the climax of the movie is the Mr. Gorbachev tear down this wall, and that ultimately that's prove it. You've been guys have been talking about what a great game, about how great communism is for everybody. Show us how great it is by opening the doors and giving people a choice, knowing that the Soviet Union could not do that, and East Germany could not do that. So he was very good at kind of mentally trapping his opponents into something where he knew they could not go ahead and go forward with it. I'd love to see that kind of philosophy approach to our
He was
station.
so good at that.
Yeah.
He did that over and over again.
Yeah. We're
Very
talking
good.
to the question time, so let's say, this guy here.
Habemos Papan. Would you agree with my fellow MAGA bros and somewhat with the tech bros? The 20th century is basically over, so it's sort of time to move on. And would you agree also that the country is in the midst of if you want to call it a second American Revolution, and that being said, as the fall of the liberal world order is occurring, where would you suggest that the country move
Pithy.
on from here?
Pithy. Okay.
Right, right. So I think it's pretty clear from what I said, I have not given up on the West, Western civilization, and America. And I was actually trying to suggest that a Reagan-esque type strategy and approach could help us in our restoration. The 21st century is a baby century. And I don't even know what's going to happen next. I can't keep up with all the changes. I think we should double down on being human. And I think Reagan would agree with me, you know, on that.
That guy behind you really thought the microphone was going to him. Yes.
All right. There was one thing I think we underestimated was the Helsinki Accords. And Reagan always hit on human rights. I don't feel the current battle is focused on ideologic. It's more like great power stuff.
Yes.
And I don't feel the ideological component. And I don't see a Helsinki Accords for China. What do you think?
I think that would be a great idea. And what's interesting in what you say is that Reagan in the 1970s criticized the Helsinki Final Act and the Accords, right? And then he quietly accepted them, absorbed them, used them to the end that they should have been as president. So it shows, I mean, that's like a bright spot out of the détente years, but in retrospect, you didn't know at the time that it was going to be that way. I think his judgment at the time was not bad. So anyway, he ends up using it, and I think that's a brilliant idea to go ahead and do something like that, because China is such a big landmass too. If you had ways of encouraging that, and not just be in China but elsewhere, you know, be in every communist country in all authoritarian lands. I really like that. Let's find some. Can anybody here get us started on that? There's probably some international lawyer here who can start us on that. Thank you.
Back there, and we'll try to get back over here, but it's not looking good, guys. I don't want to overpromise.
I believe at the top of the conversation, there was a conversation about Bill Buckley. And so I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about Bill Buckley's relentless challenge against communism.
Yes. So this was in his bones, right? This is something that from I mean, inception, but certainly from childhood, he was anti-communist because of what it was and what it wanted to destroy. So he knew, of course, what he was for. But his entire life, in some ways, is dedicated to this this cause. And the relationship he ends up forming with Reagan, they agree so much on this. So when I had that line about how Buckley wrote at one point that he was both friend and mentor, teacher, tutor, they work together in so many ways on this. But I think that for Buckley, he at one point said, when things were kind of changing with the Soviet Union, he said, if all of this ends, we'll have other battles to fight. But he still left it in the conditional. And he was very staunch on how it was the ism. And part of that's because of how Whittaker Chambers and others were so central to him in helping him flesh out over time the evil of communism. But he got it strategically, but he also really understood this moral question. Yeah.
I'm going to give you one not so serious answer and one more serious answer. The not so serious answer is that William F. Buckley very much believed in morally upstanding while not sitting upright. And he confused the Soviet Union with vocabulary words that would get you 1600 on the SAT. So one of the things I marvel at, I think it's an absolute blessing of my life to get a chance to write for the publication William F. Buckley founded, and I think George F. Will makes a strong argument as the most influential magazine of political opinion in human history, in part because no William F. Buckley, no National Review, no Ronald Reagan, no end to the Cold War, no end to the Cold War, God knows where we are. So in the end, National Review saved the world.
You're wearing a Che Guevara t-shirt.
Yeah. But I just want to observe that, like, William F. Buckley, like, it's not like the media world of the 1950s, 60s, and 70s was like, we love conservatives. And if we could just find, you know, William F. Buckley was just that good that they couldn't ignore him. That everything he wrote was so great. Well, we got to write that. The books were so provocative and intellectual and you know, jarring for the time that people felt the need to, you know, like, it's one of those things where, like, you could throw 1,001 obstacles to Michael Jordan. He was always going to be really good at basketball. You could throw 1,000,001 obstacles in front of William F. Buckley. He was always going to be that influential. And if you write for National Review, you get very used to being told, you're no William F. Buckley. None of us are, right? You know, the guy sailed across the Atlantic. He performed it at Carnegie Hall with a harpsichord. I'm not even sure I know how to pronounce that thing, that he had built himself. And I believe one of his longtime friends had said, now that's a bit much. All right, now you're just making us look bad. So no, he was unequaled. And so, like Reagan and Buckley together, you look back and you're like, it was kind of unfair to the Soviets, wasn't it? There's one guy around here, and then they're not waving at me to wrap it up, but we'll, all right, you with the bolo tie.
Trent Gruber, you talked about the importance of individual liberty, and while individual liberty is very important, without emphasis on the duties we owe to our communities, ancestors, posterity, it can degenerate into atomized license. How do we maintain that emphasis or reinvigorate that emphasis on the duties that we owe to our country?
Right. Well, first of all, I think that Reagan and Buckley both understood that it wasn't license. They understood that the individual rights, freedoms, everything else was rooted in duty. It was to do what is right. So this is a longer-term project, and I think it goes back to families too. It's nothing that the state will do. It's something that some of it will come from an individual himself or herself as they grow and learn things and decide what kind of human being they're going to be. But it all goes back to parents and family structure, and so we need to encourage that. It goes back to, we're still a much more believing country than most any other country, at least in the democratic world. And so that's something to keep encouraging that. We may have peaked on the nuns, the non-affiliated, and now going, there seems to be a resurgence of young people looking for something more meaningful than just do whatever you want. The relativism and nihilism. I think that now post-COVID, there are some good signs on a lot of that too. So again, this is a good moment for that. And maybe on the education side, again, combine some of this with the 250th birthday of America. And for those who remember anything about that they carried that forward. So maybe we can have some of the same things be celebrated so that, your generation and everybody else, they're carrying that forward, including into their own families,
Before we came out here, we were talking about the Reagan era, and as awesome as Reagan and Buckley were, just kind of acknowledging there are certain advantages or just certain factors of life that made the task before them a little bit easier. And I think a big one was the monoculture. The fact that there were 3 major television networks, 4 if you count PBS. And just it wasn't an internet. We were not a greatly fractured, balkanized society. And so, when Nancy Reagan appeared with Mr. T to tell kids just say no, everyone in America knew who Mr. T was. And it was not the time Obama was in the YouTube star, who's the woman who in the bathtub with the milk. And like there was just we're in a very different media environment. I think that makes it tougher to communicate any kind of message because it's just going to a smaller segment. Doesn't mean it's insurmountable. It just is a recognition of that challenge. And I think that with that fracturing of media, this fracturing of culture, there's been a fracturing of religion, there's been a fracturing of value, like the common language. I don't mean literally English, although some people would say that's an argument about today, but like the frame of reference of what, the kind of references that Reagan could get, the percentage of the audience that would get it, would understand it, because they'd heard those stories from the Bible, they'd heard those stories at Sunday school. Even if it was a long time ago, people got it. People, it was important to them. We're a much more fractured country, and doesn't mean it's insurmountable, but it just means it's a challenge for leaders of today. All right, this guy, hand up, order fast. No microphone for this guy. He's loud enough. No, you ahead.
So obviously there is a struggle right now in the conservative movement between those who see Russia as a potential ally and who see Russia as an enemy. Thinking back to the Cold War, Russia had a very substantial influence operation in the United States. There's a lot of evidence that they're doing something similar today.
Yes.
Would you like to comment on similarities or differences between their efforts?
Right. So in my own scholarship, but also at VOC, we talk about this legacy problem from Russia and somebody like Vladimir Putin in charge, but also those around him. If he dies tomorrow, the guy who steps into his place is also somebody who's formed back in the USSR, right? Formed by the ideology, formed by communism, formed by the KGB, formed by all of that. So it doesn't mean that everything right now is communist the way it was during the Cold War, but it's the legacy problem. So we know that, especially the KGB and others, they knew well how to do the kind of disinformation and other campaigns that you're talking about. So those are going on right now. So I think it's very important to get the truth out there. That was one of my themes throughout the talk about truth. And I think it's more important than ever, including because of some of these fractured issues, to have good, I'm fine with it being reformed, fixed, whatever, but we still need things for a broad, like Voice of America, RFE, RL, and everything else. And at home, we need to have better and better media. We need good people to go into just plain old journalism, not just opinion journalism, and short form, and all sorts of other things to get across the truth about things so that you don't face this problem where you actually have conservatives. I can't believe it that there are conservatives that think that we should be doing anything with Russia in this positive way. You know.
You ask a question that towards the end that's like, I've got like 5 hours of material on. All right, so bring up the PowerPoints. Let's get started. I will just kind of, that's the topic that will get the veins bulging and spittle, and I will be, ranting.
How
and
many
raving.
times have you been to Ukraine, you said?
Oh, only 3, but yes, Russia is the only country that shot at me. So far, I suppose I should say. Look, I think it was, Grover Norquist, who at one point, there was, some proposal had gone around for Republicans to raise taxes on something. And he had this attitude of like, Republicans don't raise taxes. If we're going to raise taxes, what are we even doing here? Let's shut it down, go home, forget it. We've lost, our reason for existence. I really feel like opposing expansionist, aggressive Russians is why we're conservatives. It's why we're here. It's what God put us on the earth for. Okay, yes, a bunch of other reasons too, but nonetheless, like that was a big central component of who we are and what we stand for. And so, yeah, I kind of baffle at that. I also, just the question of like Radio Free Europe and things like that. Think about the money that Russia dumps into RT. Think, not just the U.S. version, but they got versions on every continent on the planet.
Right.
Think about everything, the Sputnik radio. Think about, all the money that's going around to certain unnamed bloggers, unindicted, like to them, it's worth it, right? Why would they spend all that money if it didn't have effects? If it didn't say, hey, we want to influence American public opinion, so we're going to do that. So look, I'm not saying I love everything that Radio Free Europe ever did, or Radio Free Asia, or Voice of America. I'm very much of the Bill Clinton on affirmative action. Mend it, don't end it. You want to fix those institutions, you want to reform them, fine. I'm not saying everybody over there is great, but why would we unilaterally disarm? Why would we take our operations that are designed to put our version of events, our truth, our arguments out there into the public discourse and concede the field to our enemies? But hey, that's just my opinion. I could be wrong, as Dennis Miller used to say. Do we have any more? I'm looking for the frantic sign from Heritage. It looks like we're still doing okay. So, all right, one more question. We'll see how things go. That guy over there, the very dapper-looking fellow.
It's Richard.
Okay.
Your dad wrote about every important conservative of the 20th century. As you know, in his last months, he was writing his 26th book about very important people. 10 people who are unsung heroes of the conservative movement. As important as the ones that he wrote about, there are also people like Bill Rusher, Vic Milione, that need the recognition. Will you or someone else pick up that project?
Oh, Richard. Richard, that's a great idea. I will give that some thought, and you're right. We should finish out that project. And we were still coming up with names, so it was sometimes hard to stop just at 10. But I know Dan McCarthy would be happy about that too. Yeah, thanks.
Okay, in the back there.
In the vein of zombie, like Reaganism, what do you think Reagan would do different if he were resurrected today and had another reign? I think their term in front of him. Do you think the benefit of hindsight and history and experience would change the way that he exercised his presidency?
Would he still, if he were resurrected, he would still have the kind of background he did in acting, in leading things like SAG, all the public speaking he did. I think he would be comfortable being a public figure, right? He would use whatever bully pulpit he had, whether in or out of politics, to educate. I don't think he'd be somebody who would hang out on X and other things and waste his time that way, because he's not somebody who spent his time, like he could have napped more on trains and planes, right? He read, he talked, so maybe he would use the newfangled technologies, but I don't know. I mean, he loved all those notes, are all the little short quotes, so I guess he could do short stuff.
Reagan would have a phenomenal podcast.
Yes. Oh, I like that. He would. He'd be on 3 Martini Lunch.
To Rapping with Ronnie. He'd be blowing the doors off Rogan. In fact, maybe one of the reasons Rogan is so successful is the name sounds like Reagan. That actually great. And I was actually I was trying to chew over, like, is there any policy issue he might look differently? And it's also like one of the amazing things about Reagan. You could argue he contains multitudes. Is that he was the same guy who said the Soviet Union was an evil empire, and, like, moral clarity and almost a ferocity there, right? But who could end his presidency walking around Red Square with Gorbachev. And I believe a reporter said, "Mr. President, are you in an evil empire right now?" And he said no. And things with the Soviet Union had, the first steps of glasnost had been taken. But so he was flexible. He could actually adjust to whatever was happening in front of him. And I do think that there's so there's a part of me that looks and he might surprise us if he came back today. He might not be exactly the way we have it, because he did so much over such an exceptional career that there are probably cold warriors who remember this part, and there are probably social conservatives who remember this part, and there are probably libertarians who remember that part. Like, he was the proud union member who fired all the air traffic controllers, which we probably could use some more of them these days. But in a very strange way, when you've been president and done so much, and now I'm seeing a sign of tea, which probably means we're wrapping up for time. You've been a fantastic audience with fantastic questions, and by and large, you kept it pithy. And so thank you very much for coming out on a Wednesday night. It's great to see so many familiar folks and familiar faces in the audience. And, let's keep the fight going on.